So good morning, Professor Pendergast. How are you this morning?
Really well, thank you, Ashley, and a special good morning on Are You OK Day.
Yes, perfect. How are you today on How Are You OK Day?
I'm okay, thank you.
That's great. It is such a pleasure to have you here this morning, and on behalf of our team, we'd like to thank you for being with us and sharing your time and expertise. It's such appreciated.
A pleasure, a pleasure.
Now, Professor Pendergast, for the sake of the interview, would you mind just stating your name and your organisation and just giving a brief overview of your role and experience within digital inclusion?
Sure. So my name is Professor Donna Pendergast, and I'm the Dean and Head of School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith University. So we might just wait for that one. Can I just this, I'm assuming?
Yeah, they'll be able to cut that out.
Lovely. So, my name is Professor Donna Pendergast, and I'm the Dean and Head of School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith University. And my, experience and connection with the whole notion of digital literacy, digital divide, digital learning is, of course, around a focus on initial teacher education and professional learning in the field of teacher education. So very much around that educative context that we think about the digital divide and digital learning.
Yes, definitely, and it all starts with education in the end. So we're just trying we're just trying to raise that awareness for that education.
And, fantastic.
Yeah, the need, definitely. Now, as someone who is regularly interacting with university students and related subject matters, what are some of the barriers you have personally observed for people in terms of accessing technology and online services?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question in terms of what barriers I've actually observed with university students. So the barriers relate to generally access in one way or another. So if we think about having digital kind of gaps in people having access to devices, for example. So it could be around the notion that they can't afford them and therefore either compromise or have devices that might not meet their needs or might not even have access to the internet at home. So it means that access is a problem for some people, and I've certainly observed that. Another is around use, and if people don't know how to use things effectively, so their digital literacy might be not as sophisticated as somebody else's. So they might have the device, they might have access, they might have the economic capacity, but don't have the digital literacy to use digital tools effectively. And then I guess connected to that is the actual quality of that use. So being able to interpret what the digital world provides in terms of information and access to learning possibilities. So there's sort of those three things that I've observed. And so in our teacher education programs, undergrad and postgrad, we focus on that. It's a really key part of what we do. And we look at ways in which we can counter those sort of gaps in digital access.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that insight. It's really good to break that into those three categories. It really makes it easier to sort of understand where that gap lies.
Yes.
But yeah, definitely. Now, as someone with such a diverse background in education, particularly the positions you hold as a director of the board of the AITSL and the head and dean of education and professional studies at Griffith University, like you were saying, what do you think the future of education will look like as we head into such a digital-based world? Do you think we'll see an increase or decrease in the digital divide?
I think that like any tool that we use, and if we think of digital tools and digital access as being one mechanism, if we think of the history of literacy, in the history of the world, first of all, we had scholars who were those people who had the capability of reading and writing, and it was a really select group in the community. Often they were people who held great power or influence. And so, but most people in the community didn't have literacy skills. Yeah. And so, literacy was really empowered, and we would write on paper and share that, but it wasn't available, obviously, digitally, because we didn't have those capacities. Then we had the printing press, and that allowed the written word to be printed, distributed widely, and so more people had access to knowledge and information. So suddenly access to information became much more available, but still very much moderated by economics, education, but it was there. Now, with digital literacy and access to digital information and the sharing of information so readily, all the kind of boundaries that we think of that give you access to information are available pretty much to everyone if the digital divide doesn't constrain them. So we're going to see that continuum keep on going because, you know, with further developments in artificial intelligence, in virtual reality, in the ability to actually network knowledges together, it will only become greater that we utilise these capabilities. So therefore, if we're not accessing it because of one of those three factors, you know, the quality of being able to access it, being able to actually use the information because we're digitally literate, and then having access because of economic and other factors, geography that might restrict our access, then they will become more profound. So yes, digital divide has the potential to really continue to separate access to knowledge.
Yes, I totally agree. It's so exciting to see where technology will take us, but we also need to be mindful of that gap getting just further with those three components that you were talking about.
Great.
Definitely. Now, Professor Pendergast, a bit of a hard one here. If you could perhaps change one thing to help bridge the digital divide, what do you think you might do and why?
I think I would focus on that middle category around digital literacy. I think in my mind, that's something that's really crucial. And so I would focus in that particular space. And digital literacy, being able to understand, able to access, being able to evaluate knowledge, is built on literacy skills. So in my mind, I'd be working backwards through that space and looking to enhance literacy capabilities across the board. And, you know, we're talking about a global push here. So in my mind, I connected back immediately to the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And one of those goals around education is to increase global literacy standards. So I think it's an imperative that goes back to that point. And so if we follow through in a logical way, that to me is the one thing we could do that would have a really significant effect globally.
Yeah.
Locally as well, because we assume that in a country like Australia, we all have literacy standards that enable us to be effective digital users. But in actual fact, we're not there yet. We've got some work to do. So that would be my approach.
Yeah, definitely. I think we can all further our digital literacy a little bit further. And yeah, just get that knowledge out there to people who maybe aren't aware and need that little push to digital literacy. Definitely. And how do you think governments are doing in this area? Do you think there's something that needs to change or anything more they could do?
Look, I think that governments are always well intentioned in this space because, of course, that gap is a gap that then plays forward in terms of impact on health, on well-being, on access to information, etc. So I think that it's an area that is recognised as needing attention. It is, you know, one of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So globally, there's a commitment to working in this space. So I think that at a political level, there's a will, but quite often there's not a way. People don't know how to do it. So that the gap between the will and the way is the bit that's governments often miss and get kind of confused in the space in between. So intention's quite often good. You must invest. It needs financial commitment. And so I think there is a gap in the will and the way, and that's where governments can do more.
Yeah, definitely. That's really insightful. Perhaps something ourselves as a team hadn't really thought of. So thank you for that. Definitely. Is there any advice you'd like to give to someone who's wanting to make this difference and help in bridging the digital divide?
Yes, I think if we go back to the point around digital literacy and we think about enhancing that and to use literacy as a stepping stone. my advice would be to focus there. And to focus there, you then need to do things like building access through internet access, through the provision of tools that enable that. And so that all of those other things start to hook in. And so those become the enablers that sit around this very specific intent, and that is to build that digital literacy in order to then break that digital divide. So I think my advice would be to focus on literacy. Focus on literacy as a starting point, and then go from there and have a very, very specific strategy around that, contextualised, because it's not the same for every location or every group of people, so the needs different. And so one approach is not going to be the answer. It's a multiplicity of approaches that are shaped according to need and context.
Yes, definitely. If there's different problems, obviously they're not going to have one way to go about it. It's
correct.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you for that. Going back to your prior answer about the lack of access being particularly impactful, do you feel this lack of access has been perhaps furthered by COVID-19?
Look, I think we've seen that it has been, that there are some students who've been able, if we think of school students, for example, and there have been some amazing initiatives around the nation and globally. And there is it's been estimated that around a billion students at any time, if you look at a time across the year or collectively this year, have been out of school for a period of time, and either learning from home or doing something that involves them, in some cases, using digital tools. And there's an estimate that probably up to a third of those billion students haven't been able to access because of digital challenges of one kind or another, whether it be geographical, economic, age, just not yet ready to utilise those tools, or other factors, other kind of eclectic factors that layer. And it tends to be that these things layer. So if you don't have one thing, you tend to not have the next thing and the next thing. So it's that compounding effect, and you build this kind of pyramid of disadvantage around access. So there's no question that it's brought to our attention that the digital divide has not gone away. It's real, and in a moment of emergency education. So what we've seen with those billion students around the world is that there's been some form of emergency education has clicked in, and that emergency education focuses on the student and their needs exactly where they are right now. It focuses on the curriculum and what it is that we think is absolutely essential that we keep going with in terms of learning, and it focuses on the parental support and the access to resources and the teachers, etc. So those three pillars of emergency education each have an overlay of, having access to various forms of digital tools. And so there are assumptions that have underpinned some of the ways we've gone about approaching this. We've seen schools that have had to do airdrops of memory sticks because there's no internet connection. We've seen other schools that have had to print off resources and deliver them because the students don't have access for one reason or another around digital learning. So we know that it's real, and we know that it has tended to always sit in certain groups of students who might be disadvantaged in this way. So yes, it's shone a light, is what I would prefer to say. It's shone a light on the challenge that we face.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think it really does relate back to those contexts, like you were saying. For different grades, they're going to have a different need for those accessibility obstacles. And if they're only in, say, year 1 or 2, you don't know about their home life as well, if their family doesn't have access to technology as well.
Correct. And how much support is needed at home to scaffold the learning using digital tools. So is there somebody available who's working alongside the young learner to actually optimise the learning that's taking place? Or is it, is that not possible? And so we can't be inside everybody's home and see what's going on. So it's a really interesting scenario that's really sharpened our vision around this area.
Definitely. And relating a bit more back to your personal experience as well, as the Dean of Education at Griffith University, how have university students in Queensland been impacted by this digital divide recently?
I think in much the same ways, you know, we've seen the same sort of barriers being reflected there. And so some of our students, you know, if we look at the micro level at the individual students, we know that individual students have had challenges, you know, might not know how to use a certain device or a certain way of operating, being introduced to software that they're unfamiliar with, and feeling quite at sea for a period of time and having to rapidly adjust around that. We've seen all of those sorts of things happen. We've also had students come to us and say, look, I don't have access to the internet at home. What can I do? And so, you know, the provision of dongles so that people have access, those really practical things to help solve those problems. Some of our students have asked to take laptops home or computers home. We've attended to that because it's been a need, but that's very much at that individual level. So I think that what we've seen is a rapid skilling up across the board. So, and an adoption of technologies that might have taken 18 months to adopt ordinarily, have happened whole scale and, you know, very quickly in terms of also academics' ability to operate in that space. So whilst we've been quite patient and saying to people, you know, experiment in this space, have a go, do things, it became an imperative. And so it was no longer a choice, had to do it quickly. So part of the university experience is also about the academic experience and their knowledge base and their capabilities. So having to gear up quickly there. So it's multi-layered yet again, and we saw some of those impacts that I mentioned before. Digital literacy, having the capability to get the most out of the learning opportunities, having access, so those constraining factors like economics, age as being a barrier, familiarity, so some people having more access than others, all of those things. And I guess I want to also say that an assumption that some people actually have these digital literacy tools and can use them, and moving in that space and then realising, you know what, that's not necessarily the case. So we talk about, you know, our Z Genners as being in our Alpha Genners for the younger of our students, and saying, oh, look, they all use computers, they're all digital natives. No, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're capable and effective users of technology. It just means that they're more familiar with what it looks like, sounds like at a superficial level. So really having high degree of digital literacy cannot be assumed because of age.
Definitely. Yes, 100%. I totally agree with that. And I think during the situation that we're in, I think the university and the students in general have really adapted quite quick and doing quite well for such a profound issue that we've found with the need for lack of access. Yeah, definitely.
Been an amazing year.
It has. I guess that's a positive point of the year we've had.
Look, I think we've shown our ability to, you know, adapt really quickly, to pivot, and what the benefit is, because there's always a silver lining, no matter what the situation is what have we learned from that, and what do we not want to lose? So where are the things that we want to just keep and say, that was actually a really good outcome. These are the things that we want back. These are the things we want to keep. So we don't actually just we'll never spring back to be the same again. Yes. So yeah, so we will not do that. But what's our new normal? We keep hearing that phrase. That's the point. You know, what will be our starting point? Where will we be able to proceed? One of our really big learnings is that we can go faster than we thought we could. And when we don't have all of those intellectual barriers or the other things that are constraining us, and we say we've got to do this, then we can move a lot faster than we thought we could.
Definitely. It's been a big learning curve.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, are there any further comments or notes you'd like to add that perhaps we haven't spoken on yet?
Probably not. I guess The only other thing that I think is a fascinating point about digital divide is that we know from really strong data from the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that households where there's a child, whether they be or a student learner, so it could be a university student, those homes tend to have access to digital tools, where other homes that don't have a learner are less likely, but we still have high degrees of access to technology in our households. But it does mean that student learners, there's an opportunity for us to actually utilise that space and that opportunity to enhance access to technology in households as well, but also to recognise where there isn't a student learner in the household, we need to intentionally bring on board those people if we're going to proceed down this highly digitised lifestyle, because they're going to continue to be people who don't have that knowledge and that capacity and will miss out on all sorts of aspects of digital literacy and what it brings.
Definitely, definitely. That's really is fascinating. It's not something that I'd really thought of, but I guess it makes sense if there's not a learner there having that access and teaching that access as well. I know I have in my home.
Yeah.
But,
Constantly.
definitely. But yeah, that's very fascinating. Well, Professor Pendergast, that's come to the end of our questions for you.
Fantastic. Hopefully that was helpful.
Definitely, it was so helpful. We cannot thank you enough for giving us, for you giving us your time today. Your
My pleasure.
Yeah, your profound expertise is so appreciated.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Cindy. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Cassidy.